before we get started, it's very important before we start this, before I present my case, we remember key things that happened in Daniel 9 and 10. Chapters 10 through 11 to 12, it's all one thing. Okay? But chapter 9, it's what we learn in chapter 9 is should be the guiding of what we're going to see in 10, 11, 12. So a few key passages, remember in chapter 9, Daniel 9, 2-3, where it says, in the first year of his reign, Daniel understood from the books according to the Lord, the prophet Jeremiah, that the number of years for the desolation of Jerusalem would be 70. So I turned my attention to the Lord to seek him in prayer and petition with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. So remember in chapter 9, Daniel was studying Jeremiah. And he's praying about the prophecies that Jeremiah was talking about. The 70 weeks, the destruction of the temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So that right there is going to be key. And remember, Daniel is asking God in chapter 9 about Israel, about their end time. When we see end time here, please do not think second coming of Christ or something in our future. The context will dictate what the words or the phrases mean. In Daniel 9:16, remember it says, Lord, in keeping with all your righteous acts, may your anger and wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain, for because of our sins and iniquities of our ancestors, Jerusalem, your people, have become an object of ridicule to all those around us. So remember, prophecy that Jerusalem and Israel were going to get punished for all their sins. And what I'm trying to argue is God finally let them have it. He ended the covenant with Israel in 70 AD. And I think what we're going to see are historical events that happened throughout history that eventually in chapter 12 is going to land us right in 70 AD. So that's what it is. Jeremiah's prophecies, which include punishment of Israel. And then remember we went to that difficult passage, the last section of chapter 9, the 70 weeks, where remember it says 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. So anything with the end times, it is talking about Israel and Jerusalem, not about us, not the second coming of Christ. Like I said, the context here is about Jerusalem and the city, their final destruction. The end time, the end of the age is about them, not our future. So keep that in mind. And then remember 26 to 27, after those 52 weeks, the anointed one, remember we said that was Christ. The anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. That's Christ's death. Then the people of the coming ruler will destroy the city and sanctuary. And remember we talked about who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD? The Romans under the leadership of Titus. So that's the Romans there. The end will come. And then when we're talking about the end here, it's talking about Israel's end. 70 AD, not the end of the world. There will be wars, desolations, and decrees. He will make a firm covenant, that's Christ, the new covenant, with many for 1 week. That 1 week is not in the Greek, by the way. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifices and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be in the wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. Remember, Christ's death, burial, and resurrection puts an end to the old covenant sacrifices and offering. And the abomination of desolation is the destruction of the temple, the massacre of the Jews, and that decree was prophesied. Now, in chapter 10, key passages. Remember, we saw there were several angels. They weren't named, but several angels came to Daniel. In 10:14, it says, now I have come to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision refers to those days. So, who are Daniel's people? The Jews. The last days has not the second coming of Christ. This is 70 AD, the last days when Israel is no longer a covenant people with God. And it says, for the vision refers to those days. So keep that in mind. It's about Israel, their last days, judgment. It comes upon them. In verse 20, he said, do you know why I've come to you? I must return once and fight against the prince of Persia. And when I leave, the prince of Greece will come. So now we see in chapter 10, there was the earthly kingdoms fighting, but we also saw that there was spiritual warfare going on, right? So we saw that there. And just to recap, in the book of Daniel, there is 4 kingdoms that they talk about: Babylon, the Persian Medes, Greece, and then Rome. And during Rome is when the kingdom of God comes, and that's when Christ comes. Because when Christ comes to the earth, who's ruling everything? It's the Romans. And as we go through chapter 11 and we get into chapter 12, we're gonna see how Rome gets into it, right? So keep those things in mind. And remember, the last days is for the Jews, not all mankind. 70 AD is where the Jewish covenant ends with God. They're no longer God's people or in the nation. Now, okay. So normally I like to read the whole thing and then come back to it, but I think this chapter is very difficult, and I'm going to warn you right now, just based off the text, you're not going to see how it jumps from one event, one king, and then it kind of jumps a little bit into the future for a second event, a second king, and so forth. So this is where I had to come in and do all that extra stuff. Based on just the text, you're going to get lost. You're not going to know who's talking about what, but just understand that there are changes in time, changes in kings, and I'm going to tell you who they are. So we're going to go real slow. So verses 2 to 4, it's the prophecy about Persia and Greece. So Persia has already conquered Babylon. Now the next kingdom of the 4 to come up is going to be Greece, right? So in verse 2 it says, so now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are coming to stand in Persia. They are the current kingdom in power. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong, though his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the kingdom of Greece. The 4th king is the Persian king Xerxes. Have you guys seen the movie 300? Xerxes, that is him. Xerxes was arguably the richest of the Persian kings, and he was the one who ignited the battle against the Greeks. He would invade Greece with a mighty army, but he would be defeated by the Greeks in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. And that is when we see the end of the Persian Empire. And then now the 3rd empire that Daniel's in the book of Daniel that we learn is the Greeks. So this section right now, for the rest of this chapter, the Greeks are the kingdom in charge. But we're going to see what happens to them. Okay, in verse 3, and a mighty king will stand, and he will dominate with great domination and do as he pleases. Verse 3, that the mighty king is talking about Alexander the Great. He is the one who defeated the Persian Empire and literally almost conquered the world. So that's Alexander the Great. So right now, okay, through Alexander the Great, the Greeks now are the mightiest kingdom in the world. Verse 4, but as soon as he stands, his kingdom will be broken and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his own descendants, nor according to his domination with which he dominated, for his kingdom will be uprooted and given to others. So what does that mean? Alexander the Great dies at a very young age, supposedly because he had a fever. His kingdom was divided into his 4 generals. He didn't give it to his sons. He had kids, but his sons were murdered. So he was not able to give his empire to his children. So what ended up happening was his 4 commanders, they divide, because remember, at this time, Alexander the Great conquered almost all of the known world. So his 4 commanders divided the kingdom into different sections. There's going to be 2 commanders or 2 sections that we're going to focus on. So there was Cassander and Lysimachus. They took over the Greek portion, more of that side. The ones we're going to be looking at today is going to be Seleucus and Ptolemy. They are the kingdoms of, they're the ones from more of Egypt towards the Middle East, to Palestine, to Jerusalem, that part. Where more up here is more of the Greek area, which was the other 2 commanders. So like I said, there was 2 different divisions, and none of these kingdoms never came close to matching the power and strength of Alexander's brief empire. So now, verses 5 through 35, we're going to see battles between the kings of the south versus the kings of the north. And like I said, this is not just one individual. This is periods in history. Okay, and I'm going to try to let you know when a new king or a new whatever comes in. So Ptolemy, anytime you hear me say Ptolemy, whether it be Ptolemy the first, the second, the third, or the fourth, he is, or they are the kings of the south. When you hear me say Seleucus or Antiochus, they are the kings of the north. Again, it could be Seleucus 1, Antiochus 1, Seleucus 2, and whatever reason, that's what how they used to name each other. Okay, verse 5, it says, "Then the king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes, who will grow, or commander, or that's another way you could say it too, who will grow strong over him and obtain dominion. Indeed, his domain will be a great dominion." So the king of the south, like I said, is Ptolemy the first. The prince or commander is actually Seleucus. Seleucus once served as a general under Ptolemy, but Seleucus ended up gaining power and he took control of Babylon, which is more towards the north, right? His power greatly increased, and eventually he would gain more territory than Ptolemy. These 2 kings or kingdoms, along with their successors, kept years of war going on. Verse 6, "And after some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out an equitable arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will she continue to stand with the power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who fathered her, as well as he who strengthened her in those times." What in the world is that talking about? So verse 6, there was an attempt to make an alliance between the 2 kingdoms, but ultimately it failed, right? This was years later, after first Ptolemy and Seleucus. This was the next ones. The north and the south, they were trying to make an alliance. So what ended up happening was Bernice was Ptolemy's daughter, the daughter of the king of the south. She was arranged to marry Antiochus, the next king of the north, to seal that agreement between the 2 kingdoms. But there was some funny stuff going on. Marriage, at that time, marriages of political expediency have been, it was a normal thing to give. I'm gonna give you my daughter, and you give me my daughter, your daughter. That was very common at that time. However, Antiochus, the king of the north, he was scheming to do something shady. He was, number one, he was already married. He was already married to a woman named Laodice. And this woman ended up wanting to get revenge. She ended up killing Antiochus. She ended up killing Bernice and their child. That's where it says she will not retain her power, right? Now in verses 7 to 8, but one of the descendants of her, speaking of Bernice, line will stand in his place, and he will come against their military force and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display strength and all their gods with their metal images and their desirable vessels of silver and gold. He will bring them into captivity to Egypt, and he, on his part, will stand back from attacking the kingdom of the north for some years. What does that mean? Ptolemy, king of the south, captured and looted the Seleucid capital of Antioch. That's what's called the fortress of the king of the north. Ptolemy seized Syria's gods and their valuables, and then he took them back to his part in the south to Egypt. Verse 9. Then the latter will enter the kingdom of the king of the south, but he will return to his homeland. Years later, Seleucus II, who is king of the north, who was Laodicea's son, came to power from the north. He attempted an invasion on Egypt, which was in the south, but the campaign was brief. It wasn't successful, so he ended up returning back to the north, to his land. In verse 10, it says, and his sons, Seleucus, will wage war, so they will gather a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, and he may again wage war up to his very fortress. So now we are speaking of Seleucus III and Antiochus III. So you see how it's moving from one king to its successor, but you wouldn't know that just by reading that. This is where you need history and some other stuff to understand. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand, that each verse could be a different king. So right now we're in a time where it's the two brothers, Seleucus III and Antiochus III. Seleucus III was killed in a campaign against Pergamum in Asia Minor. He was succeeded by his brother Antiochus III, who began mustering troops for the Fourth Syrian War against Ptolemy IV, who was the king of the south. Verses 11 to 12, and the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will cause a great multitude and stand, but the multitude would be into the hand of the former. Then the multitude will be carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fail, yet he will not prevail. The king of the south now is Ptolemy IV. He launches an attack on the north under Antiochus III. Ptolemy would win a great victory over Antiochus at the Battle of Raphae. Because of this victory, Ptolemy became very arrogant. The Egyptian army, which is the south, slaughtered 10,000 of the Syrian troops, which is the north, in that battle, though the Ptolemaic triumph would not continue. Because of his arrogance, he ended up losing the next battle that they were in. Verse 13, now we're going to jump 15 years into the future. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the might of the south will not stand, not even their choice troops, but there will be no strength to make a stand. Verse 15, 15 years after the Egyptians, the south, slaughtered the Syrians, the north, Antiochus III invaded the south with a huge army. This caused the death of Ptolemy IV, who was the king of the south. And what ended up happening, check this out, Ptolemy V was now going to be the king of the south, and he was, I thought this was interesting, that new king, Ptolemy V, he was anywhere between 4 and 6 years old when his father died and he became the ruler of the south. In history, there are certain kingdoms where little kids have become the ruler. And I just thought that was weird. Verse 14, now, in those times, many will stand against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people, talk about the Jews, will also lift themselves up in order to cause division to stand, but they will fall down. So there were Jews who aided Antiochus. Many Jews believed that being ruled by the north would be better than being ruled by the south, because the Jews kept Because of all this war between the North and the South, there were times in history when the South ruled Jerusalem. There are times when the North would rule Jerusalem. Right? These Israelites will assert themselves against Egypt, and the fulfillment of the prediction was not the intention of these persons, but it will nevertheless result. But those who sided with Antiochus will fail. The Jews who are on his side will end up failing and losing that battle. Their defeat came at the hand of the Egyptian general Scopas, who was himself eventually defeated. Antiochus III's Syrian forces advanced against Egypt at the Battle of Panuim and won a resounding victory. Now we're going to move to verses 15 to 19. Again, now we're changing times again. 15 to 19 says, then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the might of the south will not stand, not even their choice troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to stand in opposition to him. He will also stand for a time in the beautiful land, as Jerusalem, with the destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the authority of his whole kingdom, bringing with him an equitable proposal, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of a woman to destroy it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a ruler will make his reproach against him. Sees, moreover, he will repay him for his reproach. So he will turn his face towards the fortress of his own land, but will stumble and fall and be found no more. What in the world is going on there? Okay, so Antiochus III ends up capturing Sidon from the south. The north now had control over the region where Israel was at. The north forced the south into a peace treaty. To seal the deal, Antiochus gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V as a wife. So obviously this was years later, because Ptolemy, remember, like I said, he was 4 to 6 years old when he became king. Now he's old enough to have a wife. So this is way in the future. Antiochus hoped that through Cleopatra, his daughter, he could gain further control of Egypt. However, his plan did not succeed, because his daughter Cleopatra loved her husband, and she would not help him conquer him. Antiochus would eventually be defeated. And then it says in 191 BC, now the Romans come in. Remember, I told you, after the Greeks, the fourth and final kingdom that talks about in Daniel is the Romans. In 191 BC, the Romans come in and they fight with their Greek allies. 30,000 Roman troops pursued Antiochus into Asia and defeated him. It defeated his much larger army of 70,000 in the Battle of Magnesia near Turkey. After this humiliating defeat, Antiochus returned to his country, where he was killed by an angry mob as he sought to pillage the temple of Zeus. Verse 20. Then in his place, one will stand who will have an oppressor pass through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. Now the king of the north would be Seleucus IV. What he ended up doing was he sent a tax collector named Heliodorus to collect money to pay the yearly bill that they had to pay to the Romans. Seleucus IV reigned only for a few years and was not killed by an angry mob like his father or in battle. Heliodorus, his tax collector and prime minister, evidently seeking to gain control for themselves, poisoned the king. So Seleucus IV, his own tax collector, ended up poisoning him. And some say that Antiochus IV, which is going to be the next king, had his hand in there as well. Now, we're almost done. Now we're going to go to another large section here. We're moving on to the future. This is verse 21 to 27. And it says, and in his place a despised person will stand, to whom the splendor of the kingdom has not been given, but he will come in a time of ease and take hold of the kingdom by intrigue or by deceit. That's another way of saying it. But the overflowing might will be flooded away before him and broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of ease, he will enter the richest part of the province, and he will do what his father never did, nor his father's fathers. He will distribute plunder, spoil, and possessions among them, and he will devise his scheme against strongholds, but only for a time. And he will stir up his strength and heart against the king of the south with a great military force. So the king of the south will wage war with an extremely large and mighty military force for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him, and those who eat his choice foods will break him, and his military force will overflow, but many will fall down and be slain. And as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak falsehood at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Oh, it's a lot of stuff. I'm telling you, this chapter was very, very difficult. So what's going on here? So now this whole section is about Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, the king of the north. In chapter 6 or 7, we learned about Antiochus. He was the little horn. I don't know if Nikki or Denora, if you guys remember that. We were talking about when the vision of the ram and the goat. There was the one with the little horn. That's Antiochus Epiphanes. So he's in control now. He's the king of the north. So he was the brother of the former king Seleucus IV. He had been, prior to him being the king, Antiochus had been in Rome as a political hostage. His goals was included to convert Jerusalem into a Greek culture by helping the Jews to make a transition from their Jewish culture into becoming Greek citizens and living the Greek ways. The intrigues or deceptions that he became involved in were many, but certainly the main one concerning Jerusalem was how he handled the high priesthood. At this time, the priest, when the Jews were under either the north or the south, the high priests were the local rulers. So he did some shady stuff with one of the high priests. The high priest that they're talking about, his name is Onias III. He was a Jewish priest. He opposed the Hellenization of the Jews, meaning he opposed Antiochus to bring that Greek culture and make the Jews become basically Greeks. So obviously he opposed Antiochus. Antiochus didn't like him. Right? Then we see Ptolemy the Sixth, king of the south. He came against Antiochus IV, but was defeated, and he was held as hostage. Onias, the high priest, his brother Jason, offered the king Antiochus a large bribe and promised that he would pursue the policy of letting him bring that Greek culture to the Jews if he made him the high priest. So he tells him, his own brother did him dirty. Onias' brother tells Antiochus, hey, you make me the high priest, which is going to make him the local ruler, and I will make sure that all the Jews become basically like Greeks. And then regarding the alliance made when they captured Ptolemy VI, they made an alliance with Antiochus IV to regain his brother's throne because his brother Ptolemy VIII had taken it while he was in prison in Syria. This worked, and he received his throne back, but later he broke his covenant and joined his brother Ptolemy VIII and to force Antiochus IV out of Egypt. So that little covenant, that deal that they made, they were both being shady. They were trying to use each other, but Antiochus ended up losing because the Ptolemy brothers ended up getting back together, and then they ended up kicking Antiochus. He lost that section of Egypt as part of his land. Oh man, there's a lot of stuff here. Antiochus the fourth, he retaliated after what this happened with the brothers. He retaliated and plundered some of the richest parts of Egypt. So he went back and to fight him again, and he appeared to divide the plunder. Plunder or spoils are like things that they find. They find gold or whatever, like treasures. He took them and he gave them out to his soldiers. But his grand plans to regain Egypt lasted only for a short time. Antiochus' dream of adding Egypt to his kingdom were finally acted in 169 BC. Antiochus succeeded in capturing the city of Memphis and securing the surrender of Ptolemy VI. Ptolemy VI had bad counsel during this time, which is one of the reasons why he lost. Right. So like I said, Antiochus made an alliance with Ptolemy VI, pretending to support him, but he ended up turning his back on him, and it was just all type of deceit going on. Everybody was trying to use each other to get control of their kingdom. Verses 28 to 29. Then he will return to his land with great possessions, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. That's talking about the Jews. And he will take action and return to his own land. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south. But this last time, it will not happen the way it did before. So Antiochus again returns to his land after what happened in Egypt. On his way back, he stopped in the area of Palestine where the Jews are at. He defeated, because there was some revolt going on. The Jews during this time, there were periods where the Jews wanted to revolt against all of them. So he dealt with some Jews, and he was out there killing men and women. He massacred 80,000 of them. And the Jews were infuriated at the brutality of this ruler and began a full-fledged revolt, which eventually would start what in history is known, the Jewish history, the Maccabean revolt that was led by a man named Judas Maccabean, which we'll learn a little bit later. Hearing of the reconciliation between the two Ptolemies, the two brothers, Antioch IV invaded Egypt again in 168, intended to conquer Alexandria. But this time he met with a humiliating defeat, because why? The Romans had joined forces with the kings of the south, and Antiochus IV was no match for the Roman army. So we're going through history. The Persians are gone. The Greeks and their history with their battles and the division, and now we're seeing slowly the Romans are coming in, the fourth final kingdom in Daniel. Right? Verse 30. Indeed, ships of Kittim. So Kittim, it could either be a place called Cyprus, or it could be talking about the lands of the west. But the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it refers to them as the Romans. Right? So indeed, the ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and will return home. Rome joined the battle and defeated Antiochus IV. Antiochus' embarrassment turned into anger, which he directed it against the Jewish people, the Holy Covenant, one more time. Antiochus hears of a revolt in Jerusalem, then goes back and tries to stop it, and there was a Jewish massacre. All right, we're almost done. 4 more verses. Verse 31. Mighty forces from him will stand, profane the sanctuary fortress, and abolish the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. What ended up happening at this time, so Antiochus just got defeated by the Romans. He's pissed. So he's going to go take it out on the Jews, because also he heard that there was a revolt. So he's not trying to lose territory here. What ended up happening was Antiochus worshiped Zeus. So he put a statue of Zeus inside the Jewish temple. And those who know the Old Testament, pigs were an animal that was a no-no for the Jews. So you got the temple. He erects a statue of Zeus. and then Antiochus makes animal sacrifices, and he uses pigs, which was a big no-no for the Jews. So that happened. At this time, all Jewish religious practices, such as circumcision, possessing scriptures, offering sacrifices, observing feast days, were forbidden, and the penalty was death. Verse 32, and by smooth words he will return, and by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take into action. So what's happening here? Antiochus, he had a good game. He was very flattery. So he was enticing some of the Jews to turn against God, to turn against their covenant. But there were some faithful Jews, the part where it says those who know their God, who chose to stand strong, and they'd rather die than go against God's laws, and many of them did die. And then this is, again, like I said, this is where the Maccabean revolt started. And the Maccabean revolt, the Jews were actually successful, and they had a brief period of, I guess, freedom or peace or whatever after the war, but then they got reconquered quickly. Last three, we're done. 33 to 35. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in intrigue or deception. And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the time of the end. So remember, until the time of the end. Remember what we said in the beginning, the time of the end. This is not Revelation. This is not our future. The time of the end is what Daniel was talking about when he was looking at Jeremiah's prophecy, what the angel said, the end of him and his people as a covenant people of God, and that was in 70 AD. So what's happening here? The believing Jews fought back. Many were killed. The Maccabean revolt led by Judas Maccabees, and many died. Verse 36 to the end of chapter 12, it's where we get moved even to the more future. That's why I had to stop there. I mean, as you guys saw, it was already a lot of stuff. So we're going to stop there.